Your brand may be staying on top of current trends, but are you agile enough to stay relevant, resilient, and successful as customers, competition, and the world continues to change at a breakneck pace? I'm thrilled to share the newly revised version of my first book, The Agile Brand. I'm calling it The Agile Brand Revisited. It's been updated to reflect our continually changing world, and it provides 7 principles that form the backbone of an agile brand, offering detailed insights and actionable steps for incorporating them into your business strategy. This is the book that started it all, and I'm excited to share it with you. It's now available in print and digital formats and available everywhere. Learn more by going to the Agile Brand Guide website at www.agilebrandguide.com. Welcome to Season 4 of The Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom, where we discuss business agility through customer experience, employee experience, and digital transformation. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed on this show, you can go to my website at gregkihlstrom.com and read my latest articles or get a copy of my latest book, Meaningful Measurement of the Customer Experience, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kihlstrom, and I'm the host of the Agile Brand podcast. Today we're going to talk about using AI and machine learning to achieve predictive brand intelligence, and what this means for marketers in a shift to a world of first-party data strategies. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Grant McDougall, co-founder and CEO of BlueOcean. Grant, welcome to the show.
Greg, thanks for having me. Really excited to be here and to be talking about brands and how they can use data to understand their competitors and ultimately drive performance.
Yeah, looking forward to talking about this with you as well. Why don't we start by you giving a little background on yourself and what you're currently doing at BlueOcean?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Australian. I live in San Francisco. My background started in the internet back in the late 90s. Really got excited about the notion of technology and experiences coming together. I started my career at a company called Spike, which is Australia's first digital company. And that I fell in love with the notion that you could create meaningful experiences for brands and people. I then spent some time at Modem Media, which was based out here in the US, working on companies like General Motors and Hewlett Packard. And then went to Digitas, which was led by a really inspired leader, David Kenny, and then into the holding companies. And I continue to just really build on this notion that you could use data, experiences, and creative to build meaningful experiences in real time. About 7 years ago, I met my business partner, Liza Nebel, and we just saw eye to eye on the notion that you could bring this machine-based intelligence to the creative product. And we started a company to do that, and we discovered BlueOcean as part of that. And so, what we've been doing over the last 3 years is using the very assets that brands use to drive demand, to measure them relative to their competitors, and to make that human readable and understandable. So, you're not talking about lifetime value, or you're not talking about data sets. You're talking about recommendations and things that marketers can use to drive performance.
Well, let's start by talking about consumer sentiment and other ways that brands can learn more about where they should focus their marketing efforts. So with BlueOcean, you've defined the category of predictive brand intelligence. For those listening, what does that mean for marketers, and what are some of the tools and methods that this either augments or replaces?
Yeah, so when we think about it, it's really the notion of decision intelligence. And so using brand as the lens. And for us, everything starts with the brand. It's the commercial strategy of a company. And it includes, what are they doing from a marketing and advertising perspective? What's their content strategy of the company? How do they actually go to market? And what's the relative performance? Does it actually increase market share? Does the brand grow as a consequence? And then ultimately, it is all of the emotional values. So what are your customers saying? What are your employees saying? And what's the news saying about you? Once you can do that, you have the ability to see the whole playing field. And I think that's an important component of decision intelligence through the lens of brand. And what that allows companies to do is to understand where to start and where's the answer, so they can actually do what they're fantastic at, which is ultimately using the human creativity inside the marketing organization to take action on the thing that really matters to them in line with their strategy.
And so to follow on to that, some of what you're talking about is really finding ways to prioritize, right? So what can you give an example of, how would an organization use some of these insights to reprioritize strategies?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a really large client in Microsoft. We're across 17 lines of their business on the commercial side. And so when we think about how do you do that, how do you make those decisions as the CMO? We've created a framework which has 5 areas in it. It's called familiarity, uniqueness. Uniqueness is all about, are you different in the category from a differentiation perspective? Consistency, what's the shape of your marketing? And do people recognize it? Is it timely? Is it driving the necessary commercial results? And then ultimately on the last side, it's about reverence. And, is there a loyalty component? What we do is we bring the brand or the product and 6 of its competitors into an environment so you can see them. And often what we see is, is there a relative underinvestment on the media side? Are you attracting the right, sort of consideration to the brand? And ultimately, are people sharing it? That gives us a good understanding of share of voice. So what happens in large portfolios, that allows the CMO to say, well, great, actually, we are underinvested in this brand. And we need to increase spend. Often that's a really subjective conversation between the CFO and the CMO. Now we're providing the necessary data for those kind of spend related elements. The other component is, in the case of someone at Microsoft, that they've got really high brand reverence, but they really need to build an understanding of the developer community, for instance. And so what they're doing is they're using the reverence score as a means to establish an OKR in the business, and then use that to really measure performance against it. We've had some other examples, Greg. Our friends at Juniper Networks, working directly with the CMO, he tooled BlueOcean into his environment last year, and the brand team, as a consequence of being able to demonstrate that they had a gap in their advertising and marketing, was able to sort of 4x their budget because they could actually have the conversation at the board level. And they were using brand metrics to drive that. And so our market index or scorecard allows CMOs to not only have a unified language, but to be able to communicate with quant data at CFO and at the board level for the first time, which is really exciting.
How does an agile approach help make this even more effective? I mean, so, you're talking about using AI, ML, working humans and machines working together. But, is there an agile component to this, whether it's formal agile or just an agile mindset?
Yeah, it's definitely, we as a business, subscribe to agile. That's how we build our software. And I've always thought that marketing needed to have a refocus. And so examples where, we were going into COVID and a lot of the companies that we were working with, we're trying to respond in real time. And so they used BlueOcean to understand what were the themes that were being driven, what were their competitors doing, both on the content that they were producing in the brand. And so they got to this point where they could actually understand the starting point more quickly. And ultimately that allowed them to launch campaigns at a more rapid pace, iterate on the messaging, see if it was resonating with audiences, and continue to develop, work against that. And so the ability to see that information, so having clarity of information is the first point. Being able to iterate and not have to spend 12 weeks doing traditional market research or basically just be determined only on social listening really is changing behavior. And so marketers are now at a point saying, oh, great, I have a confidence in the data. And what that's allowing me to do is get to the starting point more quickly and to actually put more content, more activities, spend more in the right places and increase media working dollars. And ultimately, I think we're seeing more efficiencies as a consequence, all through the agile mindset.
And I would imagine that, I mean, that's also feeding better data back into the funnel in the first place, right? So in other words, you're not just running the same thing for 12 weeks and then checking back in, but because you're iterating, you're actually getting better information and more accurate, or things like that back into the system. Do you see that as well?
I do, Greg. I think there's a couple of things that we see. As marketers, digital as a whole has had such a heavy bias in our communications mix because it could prove performance. Yeah. And what's happened is we've forgotten that you actually have to continually introduce your brand to consumers, and that ultimately, Byron Sharp talks about mental availability. I fundamentally believe because you can iterate and you can take learnings, what it does is it widens the funnel. It allows you to experiment in new ways. And I like to describe it as, the digital marketers of the past, we had these diminishing returns, and it was like panning for gold. We were really keen about that. What we hadn't done is put water in the pan. And so, nice. for us, it's about, you have to have brand investment. Otherwise, you get these diminishing returns on your digital investment, and you lose the share of kind of understanding within your audience. And so I think we're about to go back into an era of brand reinvention, where the quality of content, the way that we produce information, all is going to be redefined, because we're seeing the changes in privacy, where it's not about one-to-one targeting. It's going to be all about how do I establish context and audiences to keep people engaged with my brand.
Yeah, and that's actually a perfect segue. I wanted to switch gears to exactly that topic, and it's something that is certainly top of mind for marketers these days is deprecation of third-party cookies by Google and others, as well as a lot of other changes as far as device ID tracking, everything like that. For those, you touched on this a little bit already, but for those a little less familiar with these issues, can you summarize kind of where these issues kind of coincide with what you're working on?
Yeah, so I think there's two things to think about. Digital of the past. So think about what's powered Google's business has been last click attribution. So you go in, you do a search, you take an action, the marketer sees that action, and ultimately gets rewarded. And so you can actually see a relationship between what you're doing and the outcome. And so that's been the fundamental premise of digital, be it a display ad or through programmatic media or any experience. How you get tracked through that process is through those cookies. It basically gets placed a unique ID on your action, and marketers use that to do many other things, like target you in media, to personalize experiences, to really get it to a one-to-one basis. I think what's happening now is people have realized that they are being marketed to, that their data is being sold, that their information is being used to almost profile them. And so you saw what Apple did with device IDs and locking that down, using privacy as a means to differentiate their products. People like DuckDuckGo have come into the market. What that has done is meant that marketers have had to change the way that they market. So the old digital techniques, which I think is really funny, right? We're talking about digital as a whole, is almost a legacy product. Means we have to, which is weird. We have to change the way we think about it. We have to go back and say, okay, great. Well, how were brands built in the 50s? Brands were built by producing great content, which happened to be advertising. So we could get audiences to coalesce around them. And then we marketed to them. We didn't know who they were. We just knew that people loved high quality content that mattered to them. So I think we're going back, more back to that kind of mindset where brands are going to increase the value of the content they're producing. They're going to ultimately spend more time fascinating on the context of what they're producing for their audience, and then beginning to drive, using brand as the means to collect that audience in a meaningful way.
And so, where does AI and ML fit into this mix as well?
Look, I think if you think about, how do you understand context? You have to ultimately be able to understand the whole playing field. You need to know what ads are being produced, what's being consumed, what are your competitors doing on a relative basis, how are they shaping their marketing, what's their performance on a revenue perspective, and then how do people feel about that? You can't do that just by being a human and observing it. It's just too slow. We live in a digital context which is changing rapidly. So you need to have tools and techniques that can observe that content, learn from what's being said, how it's being placed on a media perspective. And so we use machine learning to not only ingest that content, but to learn from it. What's effective advertising? What are competitors saying? Where's the white space? And we do that at scale across hundreds of thousands of brands.
Talking a little bit more about this, just understanding the customer, I feel like the North Star, so to speak, is one-to-one personalization, one-to-one omni-channel personalization, true like multi-touch attribution. How close are we to that? Is that science fiction still, or is that, how close are we to living in that world?
I think we are living in a hyper-personalized world. So when I think about your Nikes, if you bought a pair of Nikes and you personalized them,
yeah,
right? That exists today. Think about recommendations on Netflix. What you like. You're living in that environment. I think so. We definitely have got to the point where machines and marketers understand their users and can target them based on how they feel, what they think, and more importantly, how they behave. And so the component of that's difficult is actually getting into attribution. So, your action and what happened when it's in a complete closed digital environment, that's live, that's real. We can do that. We can see it. The challenge is, for marketers that use non-traditional digital media, they've got market mix models. So people like the Nielsen's and the Comscores of the world have spent a lot of time building brand equity models, which are often slow. And there's not a linkage between action and sales. And so it ends up being very, very expensive. It's going to get harder to do that. And you're going to need context-aware applications as inputs to drive those, because you're going to lose a lot of your digital signal.
From your perspective, I mean, what advice would you have to, let's say the marketer there that maybe isn't quite as advanced as some of the things that we're talking about here, but understands this stuff enough to know that, definitely there needs to be a move to first party marketing. Listening and understanding the customer has always been key, but with the tools available, certainly more and more possible, as well as more and more important. Like what should they be paying attention to that maybe is either slipping under the radar, or what should be top of mind for them right now?
Yeah. So for me, the first thing I would do is I would take a market-driven approach to understanding what competitors are doing, have the ability to see that transparently and be able to act. The second thing I'd be doing is I'd be saying, look, first-party data is really important. And the tools that you've used to acquire first-party data from your field and from your channel partners and from your direct sales environments, That's great. But you have to keep fueling that data. And the only way that we're going to be able to fuel that data in the future is by doing brand-led activities. So continually reimagining, reintroducing, creating compelling content to bring to customers, to give them a reason to come and spend time with your brand. Because if you don't do that, the value of your first-party data is going to decline. You're not going to be able to continue to add new users, new behaviors, all of the things that really start to make that data set valuable. And it's largely going to decay. So you're going to have to take a brand first approach and understand that you're probably going to need to give up some of the classic demand generation activities to make space for it in your communications mix. They need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because you can't quantify all that investment, but it's going to be an absolute necessity if you're a B2B marketer or a B2C marketer. I sit with a lot of CMOs today talking about how can we put more heart, more empathy in our brands, so we can attract, acquire, and retain customers through what we're saying and doing as a brand in content, and then using that as a means through the value exchange with them to drive outcomes that you can remarket to.
Yeah, I love the what you said as far as being comfortable with being uncomfortable, because I mean, I do think that's, many things, that have happened recently have caused us to, have to rethink assumptions, and as well as just the way the world's moving. I mean, I think things are moving in a direction as far as data being so important, as well as just needing to understand the customer. So that's definitely agree with that. I think that might be uncomfortable for some people, as as that phrase would suggest, but it's, it is a matter to kind of take it back to agile, thinking here is, you don't have to be a scrum master to appreciate the need to be agile and adapt and be comfortable with change, right?
Exactly. One thing I've got to say about COVID, be it for all its negatives, it's had some really positive things. And it's really made CEOs become the chief brand officer. And so if you look at Satya at Microsoft, the way he led the company through that crisis was he used empathy to make sure that, he was putting people back to work. If you went and looked at ServiceNow, the way that they responded was in an agile way, but it was through their customers, telling the story of the customers helping people. And then ultimately, all of the tools and technologies that were deployed as a consequence were obviously software and were meaningful, but they came through this lens of emotion, being authentic, and really trying to be helpful. And so I was really pleased to see the shift in the mental mindset in CEOs. It was less about market performance, and it became, well, what are we doing within the communities we operate? How are we actually responding to this in real time, and how are we making a material difference to people's lives? And then on top of that, it's forced us all to be digital at the core, even if you're a grandmother.
Yeah, totally agree. And I do think, there's enough bad stuff happening in the world all the time. Like, I think it's very important that we do find the glass half full approach. And I know I totally agree with that. I think, the brands and customer relationships have made some big strides over the last couple of years, some out of necessity, and some, I would say, to your point about the CEO, some out of empathy, which I think is actually quite quite a positive thing. So yeah, well, it's been great talking with you here. Definitely, we'd love to have you back on the show sometime to talk a little more on the stuff we touched on towards the end, even. But
Mm-hmm.
For those listening, what's the best way for them to keep up with what you're doing?
Yeah, so definitely just www.blueocean.ai, or you can follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn. And if anyone wants to contact me, you can get me at grant@blueocean.ai, and I'm happy to take questions. And I'd love to come back and talk about empathy, leadership, and how you can use brands to to drive a meaningful impact, not only for your employees, but for the customers that you're serving and the communities that you operate in. I think it's the next phase of what we've got to do.
Well, again, I'd like to thank Grant McDougall, co-founder and CEO of BlueOcean, for joining the show. Thanks for listening to The Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom. Talk with you next week.
Thanks again for listening to the Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can access more episodes of the show at www.theagilebrand.show. To get a copy of my latest book, Meaningful Measurement of the Customer Experience, visit my website at gregkihlstrom.com. Until next week, stay agile.